Welcome to the Shooting Times podcast. The Shooting Times podcast is brought to you by Field Sports Press. The Shooting Times is available every Wednesday on the newsstand. It should be there about mid-morning, so get yourself down. Or you can subscribe, which saves you really quite a lot of money, and you get it every week to your door. I'm joined today by Tim Maddams. Tim, I never know quite how to describe you. For a long time, I said to people that you were the chef at River Cottage, which I think you were, but that was like the mid-90s. So what have you been doing since then, and what do you do now?
Well, I suppose for factual correctness, I ought to say it wasn't the mid-90s; it was the mid-noughties. But what do I do now? So now I have a sort of what I think is politely termed a portfolio career, which means you're sort of free to starve and constantly worried about paying the bills. But I do a bit of freelance chefing. I sit on a few little sort of advisory groups for various different subjects. I help other people with consultancy for their hospitality organisations, and I've got a small field sports business. And
for those of you who are watching this on video, you will notice that Tim's video quality is about 6 or 7 pixels. That's because he lives in the north of Scotland now, having moved there from Devon. How long ago was that, Tim, that you moved up there?
We moved in December 2020. We were lockdown movers.
So today we are going to be talking about the latest issue of Shooting Times, and that's what this podcast does. Shooting Times is a sort of really news-based publication. We look at the hottest topics in the world of field sports and in the countryside every week, and we've been doing that now for over 140 years, which is quite extraordinary. There was a really interesting story, Tim, in the recent issue on saboteurs on the 12th of August, the glorious 12th, which is, of course, the day that the grouse shooting season starts. Yeah. It's not what any grouse keeper really wants, is to be looking out over the butts and to see sort of balaclava-clad people coming over the hill. Is that something, Tim, that you've ever experienced?
What, a balaclava?
Yes, yeah.
I remember my mother knitted me one, a particularly cold winter in the mid-80s, but it was a bit itchy. I didn't really bond with it, to be honest.
And that was the end of your sabbing days?
Well, I don't think I've sabbed. I might have sabbed a few things, but certainly not any shooting. I don't think it needs any help with it. Lots of aspects.
It was quite interesting. So Coverdale and Nidderdale seem to be the epicenter of it. There was a very interesting comment from Lindsay Waddell, who has written for us for a long time. Really interesting guy, actually, Lindsay. He's quite critical of some of the intensive grouse moor practices that have happened over the years. But he was saying that it's really the worst thing that can happen. You've been working really hard all year to ensure that the grouse are there, and then a bunch of people turn up and sab the day. And of course, all you can really do, as he points out, is ensure that everybody's safe. I mean, you've got firearms there, so it's guns and slips, and I suppose you get on the phone to the police and you try and sort the issue out. The sabbing groups in this case took to social media to say that actually the police hadn't managed to make any impact, and they maintained their position all day. It's a really interesting one, Tim. You use social media quite a bit. There's a lot of social media content posted on the 12th, both from those who love grouse shooting and from those who don't have a lot of time for grouse shooting at all. I wonder whether those posts about how glorious the 12th is actually do us many favours. What's your feeling on that?
It's an obvious argument, isn't it? It's sort of one side is that we need to promote what we're doing and talk about it and be open and honest and best practice and all that. And the other is, well, if you keep it quiet, then you're going to have less of a problem. I think it's interesting that these sabs seem to turn up on the same moors every year. I think that's probably because they're relatively easy to get to in the middle of the geographical area that grouse shooting takes place in. They're quite a long way south, aren't they? So probably much more nearer highly populated areas. I wonder if maybe we just sort of make all the fuss about the 12th, but actually don't start until the 14th, and then they can just stand there in the cold for 2 days, waiting for it to happen, and realise that they've got it wrong.
Yeah.
But it's a difficult one. You've got to balance people's right to protest with people's right to go about their legal and lawful, enjoyable pastimes. It's what do you want me to say about it? It's one of those things, isn't it? It's here to stay. The conversation is massively polarized, which is a shame because most conservationists, within both camps, actually share an awful lot of common ground.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I've got the answer.
The only time I've ever spent much time at all with somebody who sabbed grouse moors and grouse shoots was we had fish and chips in Yorkshire, and we ended up having a very good conversation about grey partridge conservation. And I think he went away, having learnt new things. So it's sort of sad that it ends up being, with as much animosity as it does. Another story that I thought is very interesting, and it's rolled on, is the United Utilities story. So this one's been a big one now. We've been covering it week in, week out. And the latest sort of twist in the narrative is that Louise Beardmore, who's the chief executive of United Utilities, which is a big water provider, has sort of slightly backpedaled on what they said initially, that they weren't going to renew any grouse shooting licenses. This seemed to be a kind of triumphant PR win for them initially, or so they thought. And they've now said that actually they're going to engage with the 23 shoots that are affected by their decision not to renew grouse shooting licenses, because actually, they recognise that there are more stakeholders there than they perhaps considered initially. You can go back to the same people and ask for quotes kind of week in, week out. So what we decided we would do is we would talk to people in the PR business. So we reached out to a PR company in London, and a young guy who had a very impressive career in PR came back to us and said that the whole thing was really quite amusing. It's a classic PR error. He said what they've done is they've failed to consider sort of every audience. So they've looked at one audience and thought, right, here's a big win. We keep on getting in a lot of trouble for sewage leaks, so we'll go after this environmental win and everyone will be happy. And of course, what actually happened is that there were more audiences than they considered, and perhaps those audiences were slightly bigger than they thought they were, and they're now having to slightly change tack. Very interesting that Scottish Water have come out and said that they aren't going to issue any more licenses for grouse shooting on their ground, and they think that the one license that is currently in play isn't going to be renewed. So it'll be interesting to see what the response is there. Have you been following that story at all, Tim?
Well, yeah, I was aware of it chuntering around in the background. I think any major company that owns a huge swathe of upland that wants to sort of try and improve its public image would be best served by improving, as you say, the sewage treatment facilities, really.
I think it has 70,000 leaks in 2022.
Yeah, rather than trying to upset some people who are doing a difficult job, stakeholders in the same sort of area, and they're definitely managing the biodiversity there. So, I mean, the problem is if you get rid of shooting, it's not as cut and dry as this, right? I get that, but if you get rid of shooting tendencies on the uplands, what we're seeing a lot of in Scotland then is just replacement with forestry. You're getting absolutely henpecked the whole time to plant trees, and if that's the right tree in the right place, I don't really mind. But if it's a citrus spruce on a blanket bog, then you're not even saving carbon, are you? You're just making money out of loo rolls.
Yeah.
And you can't really have a curlew living in the middle of one.
No, that is very true. And then Lyme disease. So 26-year-old American supermodel Bella Hadid features in our news pages this week. It's not the first time, actually, that she's featured in our news pages. She's had Lyme disease for 10 years. She's been suffering with it. I was trying to get to the bottom of, what it was that she was stalking and where she was out stalking when she ended up encountering this tick. But I don't know what the backstory is there. But essentially, her treatment seems to have been successful. But Lyme disease is on the rise, and that seems to be because tick numbers are on the rise, in part because deer numbers are on the rise. Have you ever come across, I've come across a few people, Tim, who suffer with Lyme disease, and it's really not a nice thing to have at all.
No, it's horrible. And, it's not something you want to get, and tick awareness is something that I guess, most people who are involved with countryside management in one way or another, or spending time outdoors a lot, we're aware of it, right? You've got to get them off you as quick as you can. You've got to keep an eye out for the rash. You've got to do all the sensible stuff. I was, funnily enough, talking to a keeper over the weekend, or an estate ranger, actually, and he said the tick rise is phenomenal. It's unbelievable.
Really? And what did he put that down to? Did he just say deer, or is it climate, or what is it?
Well, the deer bring the ticks up the hill when they go down at night to feed. Then they take the ticks up the hill, but basically it's not getting cold enough for long enough. It's a 7-degree limit.
Oh, really?
If it's not under 7 degrees for long enough, you don't knock off the life cycle. And he said, one tick can produce up to 4,000 or 5,000 young.
Wow.
And so what's happened, really interesting, linking it back to the grouse thing, what they think might have happened this year is had this amazing spring where it's really, really hot, but it was too hot and dry for the ticks to hatch. And then suddenly it went a bit cold and quite cool and quite rainy. And you just got this phenomenal increase in ticks just really, really quickly. And in previous years, grouse would have been okay to get a few ticks, and then they get rid of them, and then they get a few more, and they'll be all right. But they all came at once, and that's why lots of more perhaps had pretty good hatches, good-looking little clutches, but then actually not the birds they thought of. So the tick story, in sort of parallel with the Lyme stories, if you've got more Lyme going on, it is because there are more ticks, because that's your risk factor, and there's more people getting it. But I suppose the only thing we can be grateful for here is that we've got no tick-borne encephalitis at the moment, but there is a lot of happening in grouse as well.
And tell me about that.
Tick-borne encephalitis. I think it's over in Scandinavian countries, and I'm not quite sure what the vector is, how the tick carries it, whether it's in the saliva.
It's much more serious, isn't it? I mean, it's almost like
encephalitis. I mean, it's the swelling of the brain, isn't it? It's a sort of, it's a BSE kind of situation, but carried by ticks. I mean, it's really not what we want.
No, it's not what we want. So every week, Tim, in our news pages, we have a little feature called They Said What. And it's not hard to find silly things that people have said about the environment, frankly, on both sides of the many debates that we find ourselves embroiled in. But this one, I think, was more it was more sad, really, than silly. It was Dr. Amir Khan, who is a doctor who became big on telly and is now the president of the RSPB, which makes sense. They use celebs to bolster their cause. But he said grouse shooting brings millions to the table of a select few and does nothing for wildlife conservation. Now, I mean, that's just clearly not true. And I think it's a bit worrying in a way because, look, you and I, we would never deny the reality that there are grouse keepers out there doing things that they shouldn't be doing, right? I mean, that's a truth. But it's also a truth that, waders do very well on grouse moors. There are moors that hen harriers do well on. So the idea that it's as sort of cut and dry as that, I think is sad, really. And, it's not that long ago that people would turn up on a shoot with a Basque sticker on their car and an RSPB sticker on their car. And I'd quite like to get back to that point. But when you've got somebody within the RSPB sort of carrying on in such a childish way, I don't have much hope that we're going to get back there.
Yeah, the polarising of the debate is just massively unhelpful. It doesn't do any good for anyone. And, I'm going to give you a real life example. All right, I'm a lucky man. I've just come back from the moors yesterday. And while we were up there on Saturday, we stopped for 15 minutes on the way down the hill. And there was a juvenile golden eagle that got up, flew off. And we're all scrabbling around, immediately like this, trying to get our phones out so that we can photograph it because it's a magical thing to see. We stopped 2 minutes later because there was a pair of juvenile kestrels hunting on this amazing sandbank full of sand martins. And we all got out of the trucks, we stood there, we're looking at them, we're photographing it, it's beautiful. This idea that people who are interested in or involved with the shooting of birds in the uplands are some sort of demonic creatures with no understanding of wildlife or habitats is slightly irksome. But when you've got if your lead job as did you say it's a CEO of the charity? No.
So president. So it's a sort of honorary position, I think. But that they're celebs, right? Is the thing, and I just think the interesting thing is that these guys are good at PR, right? There are other examples we can think of who sort of have these honorary positions. And I've shot with people who are in the RSPB. I've sat at the game fair with people who are in the RSPB. There are people I speak to in the RSPB quite regularly, and they're sensible people on the ground. There's a guy I met who's very into deer stalking in the RSPB. He's done some fantastic things for red-listed birds. And on the ground, people kind of just quietly get on with each other, and they realise that actually, things are complicated. But the idea that you have people taking to social media to sort of whip up hatred, basically, is really depressing. And I think I like to think that these people wake up in the early hours of the morning and think, actually, you know what, I'm better than that, and I shouldn't have done that. You've met a few celebrity chefs in your time, I'm sure.
I think I've been accused of being one myself once or twice.
Well, I'm a fan of yours. Oh,
thanks, man. I appreciate that.
So there's a few features in this issue that I found really interesting, actually. I often find myself commissioning things and you're sort of like in work mode, and then you sit down with the latest issue in the pub or whatever and actually read things kind of slowly. There's a piece on the big question of Cocker Spaniels versus Springer Spaniels.
Oh, juicy stuff.
It really
juicy
is.
Stuff.
It really is. You're not a Spaniel owner at all, are you? You're not a Spaniel man, never been a Spaniel man.
No. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-Spaniel. I'm not spanielist in any way, shape, or form. Neither cocker nor springer, nor any of the myriad mongrel versions. I'm very happy with the crossbreeds. Rather, it's everyone's horses for courses, aren't they?
But I think what's really interesting in this piece is that Eleanor Swift says lots of people get cockers because they're small, right? And that's attractive because you can pick them up and put them in the back of your car, take them to a nice restaurant, put them in a little bag, take it on your bicycle, whatever else, shooting times readers like to do with their cocker spaniel. But actually, there are lots of people who'd probably be better off with a springer. And she says that springer sheetings are easier to train. So a cocker kind of holds a grudge. So if you get annoyed with a cocker, it knows that you're annoyed, and then it doesn't want to have anything to do with you for the rest of the day. Whereas a springer, she was saying, will actually take more kind of amateur training and mistakes and so on, which I have heard before, but it's interesting to hear it from somebody who is as experienced as Eleanor.
Well, my simple method of training a dog is to have a little natter with it on the way to the shoot in the morning. Just
some ground rules.
What's expected of it.
Well, they say that with horses. They say you got to talk to them. You got to tell them what you want from them.
Just my Labrador, and he just runs off, just does whatever he likes, picks up everybody's birds, doesn't come back. He's completely ignorant.
That's quite a kind of old-fashioned style of dog work. Interestingly, cockers and springers weren't actually a separate breed at a point. They just had spaniels, and the cockers were smaller. So I think they were used for woodcock, hence the name cocker. And then springers were bigger dogs, so they sort of ended up with this split. It's quite interesting.
So they were just a spaniel, and then they've been bred carefully for different traits, and that's separated. Because you can cross them back again, can't you, and have a sprocker.
Eleanor Swift is very, very good. There's another piece in here which I thought was really interesting. We've got a column called The Secret Land Agent. So the guy who writes this works on one of the biggest estates in the country, actually, and he writes anonymously, and why he writes anonymously becomes quite clear when you read his columns. But he writes this week about the difficulty of selling shooting, and he says he sits down in the pub recently, or he sat down in the pub recently with a friend of his who hasn't bought any days at the place he works at this year, and he normally does. And he says to the guy, why haven't you bought any days this year, or do you want some more days? Do you want your usual days? And the guy says, actually, you know what? I've decided to do more fishing. And he says the funny thing is, he knows that this guy has the wherewithal to pay for the days. This guy runs quite a successful building company, but this guy says to him, actually, look, what you're offering is exactly what you were offering 7 or 8 years ago, but it costs a hell of a lot more. And there's a point when I just don't think it's worth it. And the guy also says that when he buys days now, he looks for something a little bit special. And I thought that was interesting because you used to run days in Devon, right, where the emphasis was on the food rather than on the bag.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm a firm believer that you want interest and diversity within your sporting day. In fact, I'm probably a bit worse than that. I get a bit bored on a driven shoot. There's a lot of standing about, isn't there? I sort of want to get on and move my body and hunt some animals, not just sort of stand about for 25 minutes by a Range Rover waiting. And it's not to criticise driven shooting or people who enjoy doing it. If that's the thing, go for it. I'm not averse to the odd day here or there, but places and people for me is what it's about as much as the aspect of the shooting.
But the food was the food was terrific on those shoots that you used to.
Yeah, well, I was doing small, very low budget shoot days. For easily accessible to anyone that could afford a shotgun could probably save up and have one of those days, right? So it was pretty cheap. We focused on putting the birds back in, making sure that we used as much of the game off the estate in the food as we could, having a really laid back and relaxed attitude to everything, providing some fun and interesting shooting as well as being varied. But the focus was on enjoyment of the day as much as anything else.
That's really interesting. And that's exactly that sort of day that the guy in this piece says that he wants, is sort of interesting shooting in interesting places and things that makes the shooting a bit special. Really interesting. There was a very interesting piece in this issue as well from Gareth Wynne-Jones. So Gareth Wynne-Jones, who's going to be at the Welsh Game Fair, he's a fairly punchy figure. He's a hill farmer. He's a sheep farmer. And
done some farming TV, hasn't he?
He's a TV farming celebrity, but he's he's quite there at the sharp end of farming. So quite interesting. But he also shoots, and he says that he thinks we should move away from calling it sport. He says when he's talking to people who are out with the shooting world, they don't like the word sport. I don't know. What do you think of that?
I don't really. I'm not sure I've got an opinion about that. I think, the way that things, if you're the kind of person that looks at one label of something and decides they know all about it, then maybe it might offend you to have the word sport. Let's say if you're a tennis player, world-class tennis player, and then I come along and go, oh, well, I'm a sportsman too because I go out and walk across a moor and shoot something. They might be offended by that, and I sort of get that. But I'm not really. Yeah, is it a sport? Is it a sport? I mean, there are rules of engagement. There is physical activity.
I mean, I think interestingly, it leads us down some slightly troubling avenues. Thinking, well, there are types of shooting that are more sporting than others. So is going out with your dog and shooting 2 snipe and walking for 17 miles, is that a sport? I mean, is it sporting? It's definitely sporting. It's more sporting than perhaps standing on a peg and shooting some quite low pheasants. So I think that's an interesting one. He talks about, he thinks we should call it harvesting food, which I think there is a valid point there, certainly. But I'm not sure whether the word sport is one that really upsets me. I don't think that's the first priority really that we've got.
No, it's quite a long way down the list. I can see why he's raised the point, and I think from a point of view of public awareness of how shooting is, then maybe calling it a sport is not quite the right thing. But it's probably not the top of anyone's agenda who's worried about shooting. If you're an anti, you're probably not too concerned with the semantics of how it's labelled.
with what we call it. Quite interesting. Louisa Clutterbuck, who is the chief executive of the British Game Assurance. So she has a column that she writes for us monthly. And she says that one thing that they're very keen to push this grouse season is that when you eat a grouse, and whenever they're promoting grouse, it's been sourced from somewhere which is British Game Assurance assured. You're eating grouse from a place where wildlife is managed and where various species are doing well that are in decline elsewhere. So that's quite an interesting one. Tim, your recipe is in this week's issue on cooking grouse. How long should you be pan frying grouse breasts for? Give me a sentence or two on how best to do it, because I'll
be as quick as I can. It's a bit of a sort of data blast situation. So you know about the young grouse, old grouse debate.
I was going to ask about that next. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, and it's all part of the same question. So if I've got a young grouse breast, and by young I don't mean like cheaper, but a fully grown young grouse, and then I've got an old grouse breast from an adult bird of probably 2 summers or more, they're very different things. So I would probably pan fry the grouse breast from the younger bird for a minute or 2 each side with some butter and some herbs and whatnot. The other one, I could either do the same as that, rest it a bit longer, maybe marinate it so that it was tender and serve it slightly pink. But what I really like to do with old grouse and pigeon, for that matter, is to sear it from cold, very black and blue, which is what I've done in this week's recipe for the shooting times, which is quite exciting.
Why is it that old birds taste different? Why is that?
Age affects all meat carcasses. So a chicken is 42 days maximum age at slaughter.
Really?
From a industrial chicken. Industrial is not the bad word, is it? Industrial, but from a non-free range system, and even from a free range system, it's probably not very far off that, unless it's a kind of outdoor organic grass pasture system. They don't live for very long, so they don't have a lot of flavour. They get there very quickly. A young grouse, obviously, the young grouse. Grouse is a naturally flavoursome meat. It eats a lot of interesting stuff. Lingonberries, blaeberries, lots of heather, lots of insects when it's young. Incredible bird.
Yeah.
It has to grow to maturity very, very quickly. Has incredibly rich meat. If you add to that older bird, give it a bit, it's like the difference between lamb and mutton. And then if that's a cock grouse that's been holding a territory for a few years and maybe it's, it's quite old. Don't know how grouse live, how long they live for, but let's say it's 8 years old. I think that's probably possible.
Be pretty old, yeah.
That's then like eating a very old entire ram, to use the same sort of scale. So it's going to be more flavor. So that's the thing. I used to say definitely that old grouse needed much stronger flavors to go with it, and probably it was going to be slow cooked and braised, and I might make it into a pate. I think I've revised that opinion, except for very extremely aged grouse. I think sort of, can we have a new category of middle-aged grouse?
Middle-aged grouse, yeah, exactly.
I'm going to go with the middle-aged grouse.
Maybe we should do a cookbook, just the middle-aged grouse cookbook. I think that would sell really well. I think it could be a real hit.
Yeah, I could get maybe 3 or even 4 copies sold. I might punt it to Random House, see what they say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, that's really that's really interesting. I also find when I cook grouse from different places. So last year I had a grouse from Yorkshire and a grouse from the Isle of Lewis next to each other, and they were like completely different birds. You know, the size of the one from Yorkshire was extraordinary compared to the one from the Isle of Lewis.
Okay, well, the one from the Isle of Lewis was smaller.
Smaller, much tougher. It was interesting actually. It was very interesting.
It's a harder life up in Scotland, isn't it?
Well, as you know, that's why you're looking so. You know, you look like you're 25-year-old when I last saw you, Tim.
Well, looking like I classify as a middle-aged grouse. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Well, that brings us to the end of the Shooting Times podcast. The Shooting Times will be available on the newsstand on Wednesday, and you can subscribe at shootingtimesandcountry.com. We've currently got a subscription offer on, which includes shooting insurance. So, you know, we all need to be insured to go out and shoot, or we all should be insured. So with our offer, you can be insured and also stay informed. This has been the Shooting Times podcast, published by Field Sports Press. The latest issue is on the shelves today, on the shelves for a week, and we very much look forward to getting back on the airwaves next week.